Donald Trump didn't start this crisis with tanks or tariffs. He started it with a sentence. From a stage in Washington, he declared that America could no longer afford to let water flow north into Canada. In his words, the United States had a right, even a duty, to tap into Canada's rivers and glacial lakes to save its drought-stricken heartland. He framed it as necessity. In reality, it was extortion dressed up as policy. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're not talking about another trade war, another tantrum over steel, cars, or migrants. We're talking about Trump's latest obsession, turning water itself into a weapon of empire. And for the first time in decades, a supposedly smaller ally did something unthinkable. It told Washington no and meant it. The moment Trump floated his plan, markets heard opportunity. Consultants started whispering about a continental water grid. PowerPoint slides projected new pipelines, new dams, new profits. Early estimates put the potential project cost at $600 to $800 billion over 20 years. Wall Street saw fees. Construction giants saw contracts. Trump saw a new campaign slogan: "We saved American farms." But in Ottawa, they heard something else, a threat, not against trade, against sovereignty. Mark Carney, a technocrat famous for spreadsheets, not speeches, stepped up to the podium. No theatrics, no shouting, just 12 words that cut deeper than any tariff. Canada's water is not a commodity, it is our sovereignty. That line landed like a political earthquake. For once, the applause wasn't for a deal signed. It was for a deal refused. Trump was humiliated, not because a negotiation stalled. That happens all the time. He was humiliated because the script he relies on was broken. The script where America demands, the ally hesitates, and then eventually caves for partnership and jobs. This time, the ally didn't blink. A G7 country told a self-proclaimed master dealmaker that his privilege had limits. To understand why this cut so deep, you have to look south, not north. Look at the numbers in America's own backyard. Over the last decade, some Western reservoirs have lost more than 50% of their capacity. Lake Mead hit its lowest level since the dam was built. In parts of California's Central Valley, groundwater tables have fallen by tens of meters. At least 25% of U.S. fruit, nuts, and vegetables depend on water that no longer reliably exists. This is not abstract. It shows up on receipts. The average American household has seen food costs jump by double digits in just a few years. In some farming counties, insurance payouts for drought losses have tripled. Cities from Phoenix to Las Vegas have faced water restrictions that feel less like city planning and more like wartime rationing. And while families cut back on showers and lawn watering, corporate agribusiness still pumps millions of gallons to grow export crops and animal feed. That's the contradiction Trump never touches. His America First is never aimed at the corporations draining aquifers for profit. It's aimed at the neighbor who refuses to bail those corporations out. Faced with this reality, Trump did not propose serious conservation. He did not attack wasteful water use, did not challenge agribusiness subsidies, did not confront climate denial inside his own movement. Instead, he reached for the same imperial shortcut America has used for generations. If we are running out, let's take more from someone else. Water pipelines from Canada, massive cross-border transfers, a new era of extraction sold as continental destiny. The language was brutal if you listened closely. He talked about unlocking underused resources, about surplus Canadian water, about aligning nature with growth. All of it built on one quiet assumption, that Canada exists to offset America's bad planning, that a country which protected its lakes, rivers, and snowpack should now pay the bill for a superpower that didn't. Carney's refusal ripped that illusion apart. His statement also exposed a deeper economic fault line. For decades, U.S. prosperity has rested on three pillars: cheap energy, cheap credit, and cheap nature. Oil from abroad, dollars printed at home, rivers and aquifers treated as infinite. Under Trumpism, that model wasn't questioned, it was glorified. Drill more, deregulate more, pretend limits don't exist, and scream fake news at anyone who mentions them. But you can't insult a drought away. You can't bully a lake into refilling. The data briefing Trump received before that speech, according to senior officials, was grim. Internal projections showed that by mid-century, up to 40 million Americans in the Southwest could face chronic water stress. Industrial users from semiconductor fabs to power plants were already warning of supply constraints. One internal scenario suggested that without new sources, parts of the region could see a 5-7% hit to GDP over 20 years. Faced with those numbers, a rational leader would reorder priorities, accelerate climate adaptation, tax heavy water users, invest massively in efficiency and desalination, force agribusiness to change. Trump chose something else. He chose to externalize the crisis, export the problem, shift the blame, turn to Canada and say, your lakes will fix our politics. That is why Carney's 12 words matter. They weren't just a line in a press conference. They were a line in the sand drawn in water. For the first time, a key ally refused to let American capitalism turn their ecosystem into a line item on someone else's balance sheet. It was a reminder that in an age of climate crisis, real power belongs not to the loudest voice in the room, but to the country willing to say that some things are simply not for sale. That single refusal did something Washington never planned for. It flipped the power map of North America. Overnight, Canada stopped being the polite junior partner and became the gatekeeper of the one resource the United States cannot print, drill, or invade into existence: water. While Trump ranted about ungrateful neighbors, investors were staring at spreadsheets that suddenly looked suicidal. At least $300 billion in projected infrastructure, energy, and agribusiness plans in the U.S. Southwest quietly assumed one thing: that someone, somewhere, would always keep the taps open. That someone was Canada. Think about the scale. The Great Lakes hold roughly 20% of the world's surface fresh water. Canadian territory sits on almost half of that system. For years, American developers treated that like an unspoken guarantee. They bought land as if pipelines would magically appear. They built suburbs in the desert as if snowmelt in the Rockies and Canada's lakes were a permanent subsidy. The water was never priced properly into the model because geopolitics was never priced into the fantasy. Trump's demand forced everyone to price it in. Within 48 hours of Carney's statement, shares in several U.S. water utility conglomerates dropped by 7-10%. A composite index tracking Southwest water-sensitive industries shed nearly 12% in a week. Bond spreads on some municipal projects ticked up as investors asked a simple, devastating question: what if Canada means it? And while markets panicked, something else shifted identity. Canadians, often caricatured as America's friendly backup singer, suddenly watched their prime minister act like a headliner. Environmental groups called him a guardian of the basin. Indigenous leaders who have defended water rights for generations saw in his words a small but overdue recognition of what they've been saying for decades. Water is not a commodity. It is a relationship. Contrast that with Trump's base messaging. On conservative talk shows, hosts framed Canada's refusal as an attack on American farmers. They paraded images of dry fields, desperate ranchers, and shrinking reservoirs, all real, and then pointed the finger north instead of at the fossil fuel lobby. The agribusiness giants or the politicians who spent years denying climate science. It is the same trick Trump used with trade and immigration. When wages stagnate, blame Mexico. When factories move, blame China. Now, when the climate bill comes due, blame Canada. But the numbers tell another story. Over the last 40 years, U.S. agricultural policy pumped billions into water-intensive monocultures in arid regions, subsidizing crops like alfalfa and cotton that make no ecological sense in a desert. Some estimates suggest that up to 10% of Colorado River water is effectively exported inside animal feed and hay shipped overseas. This is not Canada's doing. This is deliberate self-sabotage wrapped in the flag. Instead of confronting that, Trump tried to rebrand desperation as strength. His team even floated a term, mutual hydrological security. Underneath the jargon was a simple message. Canada has surplus water, America has surplus capital, so both sides should do the rational thing and turn lakes into profit streams. If that sounds familiar, it's because it's the logic of every failed empire. Our overconsumption is your responsibility. Carney's government rejected that frame outright. Officials close to the talks reportedly calculated that once Canada agrees to treat fresh water as an export commodity, it becomes nearly impossible to reverse. The pressure from investors, multinationals, and foreign governments would be relentless. In plain language, say yes once and you are owned forever. The blowback from Trump's camp was immediate and ugly. He accused Canada of hoarding water, of weaponizing geography, even of betraying the spirit of the alliance. This from a man who spent years threatening tariffs on aluminum, lumber, and autos, and openly musing about pulling out of security arrangements if allies didn't pay more for U.S. weapons. That's the core hypocrisy. When Trump uses economic leverage, he calls it strength. When another country defends its own lifeline, he calls it blackmail. Meanwhile, the people who actually suffer from America's broken water politics aren't in Trump's boardrooms. They're in the fields and on the margins. In one California county, small farmers report drilling wells twice as deep as a decade ago, paying 3 times as much for less reliable water. In some native communities, residents still lack safe running water, while nearby golf resorts and data centers consume millions of gallons. But Trump's solution is not justice. It is annexation by contract, and the rest of the world is watching. In Beijing, Delhi, Brasilia, and Brussels, planners took note of what happened when a U.S. president tried to turn a neighbor's rivers into an emergency reserve. They saw that an ally can still say no and survive. They saw that global markets, after an initial panic, did not collapse because America was denied something it wanted. They saw that in the 21st century, real sovereignty will be measured less in tanks and more in basins. That is what terrifies Trump and the billionaire class around him. If water, land, and minerals are treated as sacred limits instead of infinite inputs, their entire model of extraction capitalism falls apart. Without cheap nature, the numbers they promise never add up. So this isn't just a story about one bad idea for a pipeline. It is a crack in the myth that the United States can always turn its neighbors into spare parts for its own failing machine, and a reminder that in a warming world, the real superpowers will be the countries willing to say enough before the last river runs dry. Once you see that crack in the myth, everything else comes into focus. Look at the map. The Great Lakes alone support more than 40 million people and nearly a third of U.S.-Canada trade. For decades, both countries treated that basin as a shared trust, not a shared ATM. They built compacts that explicitly ban large-scale diversions. They wrote into law what Trump refuses to accept. You do not play roulette with the last functioning freshwater fortress on the continent. Yet even before this crisis, American developers were quietly testing the perimeter proposals for bulk water exports, bottling schemes, legal loopholes to move products, not water. The logic was always the same: turn scarcity somewhere else into profit here. Trump didn't invent this mindset. He just shouted it into a microphone and tried to slap a flag on it. And here's the economic reality he will never admit on stage. Without Canada's cooperation, the cost of America's water addiction explodes. Independent analyses already suggest that adapting the U.S. Southwest to long-term drought through desalination, conservation retrofits, and infrastructure overhaul could easily cost $1 to $1.5 trillion over 3 decades. That's money that will not go to schools, healthcare, or debt relief. Under Trump's vision, that bill doesn't go to the billionaires who drove the crisis. It goes to taxpayers, workers, and small communities asked to tighten their belts while the same corporations keep cashing in. This is how Trumpism always works: socialize the costs, privatize the benefits. Tell a farmer in Arizona paying triple for irrigation water that his enemy is a Canadian prime minister defending a lake instead of the agribusiness conglomerate that pushed him into water-intensive contracts. Tell a laid-off worker watching food prices spike that the culprit is foreign hoarding, not decades of climate denial and regulatory capture. Wrap the lie in nationalism and hope no one reads the fine print. But people are reading it now, including in America. City councils are starting to pass local rights of water ordinances. Some states are considering bans on exporting groundwater through backdoor channels. Engineers are openly warning that building new mega pipelines will lock in the very model that got us here. Even the Pentagon, in its own risk assessments, has flagged water scarcity as a national security threat that cannot be solved by bullying allies. And on the other side of the border, the logic is even clearer. Canada has watched this movie before with oil. Once you agree that your land is just supply, your politics start revolving around pipelines, not people. Entire regions become hostage to commodity prices. Corporate lobbyists write your climate policy. You are told that any attempt to pull back is irresponsible because investors will be spooked. Now imagine that dynamic with water, the one resource you literally die without. That is why Carney's stance matters beyond one political cycle. It signals a different doctrine: prosperity without submission, growth that does not require auctioning off your ecological future to rescue a neighbor from its own denial. It is imperfect, it is late, but it is a break from the idea that the only serious governments are the ones that always say yes to big capital and big neighbors. For Trump and his allies, this is existential. If more countries adopt a sovereignty over resources stance, the whole architecture of American leverage starts to crumble. You can't threaten tariffs to force a pipeline that doesn't exist. You can't deploy troops to occupy an aquifer without declaring the end of the rules-based order you pretend to defend. You can't keep calling yourself a superpower if you need permission to drink. So he does what he always does. He lies about the problem. He tells you this is about Canadian arrogance, not American addiction. He tells you this is an attack on the American farmer, not a defense of the Canadian citizen, the indigenous guardian, the global climate. He tells you that saying no to a doomed pipeline is economic treason while ignoring the real betrayal: decades of policy that treated the atmosphere as a dump and the water table as a bottomless well. Underneath all the noise, the numbers are brutally simple. A hotter planet means less reliable snowpack, more intense droughts, and more pressure on every remaining river and lake. That's physics, not politics. You can deny it, delay it, or tweet at it. You cannot vote it down. And that is the real indictment of Trump's water gamble. Not just that it failed, not just that it backfired diplomatically, but that it delayed the only conversation that matters. How a country that built an empire on abundance learns to live inside limits without collapsing. Because in the end, Trump's legacy will not be measured by how many walls he tried to build or how many deals he claimed to sign. It will be measured by how much time he helped waste while the reservoirs dropped, the lakes warmed, and a thirsty superpower discovered too late that you cannot bully your way out of a dry century.